So how can I learn to discern healthy boundaries from my cold emotional walls? How can I start to learn what healthy boundaries feel like in the body and start to move in a direction with practice? How can I slowly choose healthy over unhealthy coping skills? What a wonderful question. So the first thing I want to tackle here is, what is the origins of boundary confusion? Where does that even come from? Well, boundary struggles usually stem from when our parents or our caregivers did not respect us as mentally, emotionally separate and autonomous human beings. And so they tend to project a lot of their own thoughts, feelings, and perceptions onto us. And when we are young, especially, we tend to take in those projections and we adopt them as our own. I call these indoctrinated beliefs. And then over time, we start to gather evidence in our own lived experience to support those notions, and then those become self-created limiting beliefs. Okay. And so over time, we learn that love means projecting onto a partner or taking in what they are projecting onto us, even if it causes confusion. So over time, you will start to feel invaded upon and either unconsciously or consciously start to invade upon others as well with wants and desires, because that's how you've been taught to relate to people, right? And you weren't really given any consistent models for where the lines, right, the boundaries, the edges of us exist between you and someone else. And that makes it very difficult to know how to recognize, name, claim, and reinforce boundaries, let alone respect them, right? And so because this is in essence a very extreme circumstance, we tend to stumble around with trying to assert our boundaries in very extreme ways. And that manifests through extreme assumptions, extreme assertions and evaluations, and extreme behaviors. Okay. And we enact these towards ourselves and towards others. Okay. So then we start to perceive the world in very concrete ways, and we draw very harsh lines and borders around things. And so then we slip into what's called black and white thinking, or either or thinking. So if you don't want to sleep with me, then you must find me repulsive, right? If you don't want to commit to me in this instant, then you never will. If you don't like my pasta, then you think I'm a horrible cook, right? If you break up with me because things aren't working out, it means you never loved me at all and everything we shared doesn't count, right? So just give me a thumbs up or a yes if you relate to this or you've encountered this in your experience, whether it's yourself or other partners. And so what are unhealthy boundaries versus healthy boundaries then? Okay. So I really feel like the quickest way to kind of suss that out, and it sounds like our inquirer is on the path to doing this, is to pay attention to the quality of thoughts that are going through your mind and the sensations that are going through your body. So in this case, our inquirer identifies with more of a fearful avoidant attachment style. Now, avoidant boundaries are usually somewhat rigid, but also fragile. So when you have something that is rigid, it's kind of brittle. And if you apply not even too much force, it's going to just fracture. So this is the confusion that oftentimes people think that avoidant partners are too boundaried. Their boundary walls are too thick and too high. That's inaccurate, in my opinion. They're usually the most sensitive on the spectrum. And what's happened is their boundaries have become brittle but fragile. Okay. So when we have someone that leans towards avoidant tendencies, whether it's dismissive avoidant or fearful avoidant, deactivating strategies are usually the coping mechanisms that they are using in order to manage the anxiety that they're feeling, usually stimulated by someone trying to get close to them on an intimate level. And so these deactivating strategies on an unconscious and usually unintentional level tend to manifest in a couple different ways. Generally speaking, these deactivating strategies are going to look like withdrawing, right? So this is probably the most common one. People who withdraw, right, tend to come across as emotionally distant. They may avoid situations that would encourage intimacy or social situations. They can become silent or unresponsive when you're asking personal questions, or maybe they're just giving you one-word answers. they tend to minimize what's going on. So that means kind of downplaying or ignoring the deeper emotional communication that's going on in the moment. This can also come into play when you're sort of minimizing compliments or expressions of affection, or you might downplay the significance of something going on in your life. Then there's intellectualizing. So intellectualizing is when we tend to fall back on things like logic or rational explanations and tend to overanalyze our emotions as a way of escaping them. It's kind of trying to think our way around life rather than feel our way through it. And so when we over intellectualize, we tend to focus on the minutia, right? Every detail. We use technical language and jargon. We avoid language that would bring us into a more centering space. So in conversation, someone might say, I'm feeling, my throat is closing up and I'm feeling really scared right now. And then the partner might say, well, this is your childhood baggage that's probably coming up and you're being triggered right now. Let's step into our emotional regulating tools so that we can bring you back down and deactivate you. And maybe that's what's happening, but that's not what that person needs to hear in the moment. That's not connecting to their experience in the moment, right? What would be connecting to their experience? Oh, that must be such an awful feeling. Do you need a hug? What support can I provide you right now? Let's punch pillows and howl at the moon. But it's a more embodied way of connecting to them in that moment. It's not intellectualized, right? It doesn't mean you can't use your intellect in the moment, but you're using it in such a way that fosters connection instead of pulls you out of it, right? So that's, in that way, we might call it more consciousness raising. So these are some characteristics that you might want to be aware of when you feel yourself closing up and defaulting to, let's say, boundaries that are going to limit your possibilities for connection. Recognizing those patterns can, over time, allow you to breathe, take a breath in the moment when you feel yourself starting to close up. And that's the embodied part, right? When we have these sort of rigid but fragile boundaries switching on, you're going to feel it, where you're going to tense up, you're going to become more concave, you're going to close up. There's going to be a wincing, there's going to be a pulling away, there's going to be a downward gaze or a moving away from gaze. There's going to be a turning away, the body language, right? So all of this is going to manifest in the body. Now, well, what's the other side of this? So let's look at what we might call secure or healthier boundaries that allow you to be more socially engaged and have more what we call interdependent behaviors in relationships. Right. So in attachment theory, they would refer to this as involving a sense of personal autonomy while also being able to depend on the person that you're with, right? So you can have, you retain your sense of individuality while be feeling closely intimate with your partner. And so what we would call healthy boundaries would be boundaries that allow for there to be that circumstance. So for example, when you're able to express healthy boundaries, there's often much clearer communication going on, right? So when we're closing up and we're fearful and we're activating, or we're using deactivating strategies or even activating strategies, as in the case for some fearful avoidant folks as well as anxious folks, then usually we're using vague language, oftentimes to obscure our needs, either because we don't really know what our needs are, or because we're afraid if we vocalize them, then they will be rejected. And if our needs are rejected, then the relationship is threatened and the attachment anxiety turns up to full volume. Everyone under the sun has a nervous system. Everyone under the sun experiences threat to the relationship at some point. The difference between an insecure or secure response is basically the narratives going through their mind in that moment and what they think the potential solutions are. So you feel that twinge and you're like, ooh, I felt that twinge. And I'm wondering where that's coming from. And I'm going to ask questions to get really clear about where that's coming from and what I can do to find a solution for this. As opposed to, ooh, they're trying to control me. This is going to end badly. I'm going to pull out before things get really bad, no harm, no foul. Or, ooh, they're trying to get away from me. They're calling me histrionic. That's ridiculous. Like my needs are completely valid and I need to have them met and they better do it or else. So we have these different, there's a level of curiosity when we have an open and healthy and flexible boundary. And then there's a level of closing up fearfulness, defensiveness when we have quote unquote like an activating or a deactivating strategy going on, right? Maybe we call that unhealthy, but it's really just a growth process. If you are struggling in a conflict, even though you're in a conflict, there's still going to be an expression of mutual respect, right? Each person is still going to respect the other person's feelings, thoughts, and opinions. They're still going to perceive them as valid, right? And they're not going to try to conflate it with some villainous intention. There's a sense of personal responsibility, right? There's taking accountability for what the impact was of our behaviors, while at the same time being present with that, not allowing shame or embarrassment to turn our defensiveness, being present with that and saying like, wow, I appreciate you telling me, it's not easy for me to hear, but I appreciate you telling me that this was your experience because it's important to me that I'm contributing to your emotional well-being. And not taking full responsibility for your emotions, but understanding that there are degrees of influence in a relationship. That's the joy of being in one. We get to utilize that third thing that is created in a relationship to grow within ourselves and with each other. So why would we deny that there are these degrees of emotional influence between us? Because that is the gift. Like that's a resource that we can use to become so much more than we could ever be on our own. I want to contribute to your well-being. And so please tell me more about how you're experiencing this in the moment. And then that will help me communicate to you what I'm experiencing, and we can probably find some solution here. And that requires, of course, emotional regulation. So that means that we are able to, that regulation doesn't mean calm yourself all the time. That's not what that means. It doesn't mean that you're an automaton with no expression whatsoever. That is not what emotional regulation means. It means that you don't feel as though you are out of control. You've lost your mind because of your emotions. It means that you're able to be present with your emotion. You're able to express that emotion, and that emotion doesn't subsume your conscious mind to the point where you're saying things that are not aligned with your core values and principles, right? Not aligned with your intention for this relationship. My intention is to be in a reciprocal relationship with spirit of love and generosity and caring and mutual respect. If in that moment you feel so threatened that you start tearing down their character and you start spilling out all the ultimatums and doing things that are intended to demote their power in some way in the context of the relationship, then you've become dysregulated because the emotion is taken over and now that's your identity. But we are not our emotions. We are not our thoughts. We are the part that reflects on our emotions and our thoughts and decides which of those aligns with my values and my priorities and my beliefs and my principles. That's why sometimes people say, oftentimes there's some confusion when we're first establishing boundaries, but I feel this way, so it must be the truth of who I am. No, you feel that way. So there's really important information there, probably about unmet needs and a boundary that's requesting expression. In my Hungry Love program, we might refer to this as a part, like an inner child or a managing part, or something like that, that's piping up to let you know something about the alignment between the essence of your being and your waking mind, your perception of yourself. So it's information. Thoughts are information. Emotions are information. And you get to decide how you're going to express them. You get to decide how you're going to articulate that. And that decision comes from noticing, how aligned is this with my principles, values, and priorities, right? So just because you say whatever you think doesn't mean that you're very honest about who you are. It means you have no filter. And that's okay. We have to learn how to develop that filter over time, right? Same thing with emotions. It's different for someone to say, oh, I'm feeling really mad. And they get red-faced and they're kind of vibrating with anger. I have this fantasy of just punching them in the face, right? And then we have someone who just punches them in the face. One is emotionally regulated, one is not. Then, of course, healthy boundaries allow us to experience support and connection. This is in the attachment lingo, we call this co-regulation, but basically the idea that you can use the energy exchange between the two of you to foster a sense of equilibrium inside of you individually. So the shared space becomes a resource for your internal growth and well-being and feeling supported, right? You feel like you're just like someone gets you and they're there for you. And that is helpful, especially in times of need. Okay, so that's just an idea of how it looks when we are closing up with quote unquote unhealthy boundaries, and how it might look if we had healthier boundaries in place in opposition to that or in comparison to that. So how do we establish these healthier boundaries? So let's say that we want to start implementing boundaries and we want to start implementing consequences for when people cross them, because that's what happens, right? We tend to either over people please and then we feel resentful or burdened because we didn't know how to say no, or on the other side of it, we say no to everything because we're super sensitive and we end up missing out on what's available in connection and relationship, right? So what happens oftentimes when we first kind of put ourselves to this task is we start confusing ultimatums for consequences. Okay. Now, if we want to get really semantic, an ultimatum could be a consequence, but I want to maybe just use consequences in a slightly different definition here. Consequences as being any action that you take in the spirit of self-advocacy to honor your boundaries, to express and honor your boundaries. Okay. So here's the difference that I think exists. When we conflate consequences with ultimatums, like either or scenarios, this is really an expression of what I consider to be enmeshment. So consequences, on the other hand, are really judicious and they're self-advocating reinforcement of your personal boundaries. It's not looking to someone else's behavior, what they will or won't do to dictate how happy you're going to be and what you're going to do in response. It's more like, this is what I choose for myself, and you can decide to participate or not, right? So ultimatums, they really do not leave any room for exploration, for co-creative solutions, or alternative paths to explore. And because of that, they communicate a lot of emotional dependency, energetically speaking. So I want to just give you an example. So let's say an ultimatum. And as I said before, I feel like ultimatums tend to express enmeshment and a certain degree of emotional dependency. So for example, I am sick of your opinion. Criticize me one more time and I am leaving you, right? Now, maybe they are critical. Maybe they've been critical for months, years on end. This person may be perfectly justified in leaving. But listen to how it sounds when we present this as a consequence as opposed to an ultimatum. Okay. And again, I feel like consequences are boundaried and more emotionally independent. So, for example, when you speak like that to me, it feels unsafe. And then I start questioning your integrity. And so, feeling safe and trusting in a relationship is of the greatest importance and priority to me. If you're interested in that kind of relationship, then I can tell you what I would prefer to hear. I'd also be interested in learning how you might express appreciation instead of criticism. Otherwise, I'm going to need to reevaluate my romantic investment here. Right? So it's not about, I'm going to do this to you one way or the other. It's more about, here's what I'm going to do in response to the situation that's being presented to me. And the reason why this is boundaried as opposed to enmeshed is that when you say it that way, you're acknowledging your own autonomy in the situation and you're acknowledging their autonomy in the situation, and you're reclaiming your power by saying, you choosing to meet me in this place is your choice. That's your power. That's your ability to an agency that you're expressing here. And me choosing to remain in it, whatever you do, is also my choice and me stepping into my power and an expression of my personal authority in this situation. It's in essence, how do we recognize when we're slipping into boundaries that are probably, let's say, more amorphous, or creating these rigid but fragile kind of constructions between us and the possibilities for connection? I would probably boil it down to 3 primary dimensions, right? And the first is when you notice that you or someone else is trying to assign fault as a way of avoiding their personal responsibility, right? When there's always a blame game going on. Secondly, when we're falling back on intention to avoid answering for the impact of our actions, or when we are using intention to excuse somebody else's actions and their impact on us, right? And thirdly, when our actions are not matching up with our words, and when we are either denying or invalidating what we are perceiving, or someone else is denying or invalidating what we are perceiving with our own eyes and our own senses. And of course, the other side of that, we are denying what someone else is sensing and perceiving with their own eyes and their own senses, dismissing and validating their reality because it doesn't match up with what we think it should be. Some other things you might do is ask yourself some questions. If we're stuck in an enmeshed dynamic, here's a couple of questions you might ask yourself, because when we are enmeshed, we tend to just take in the emotional energy and the feelings of other people, and then we might struggle to know what's mine and what's theirs. So in those cases, let's say that you start, for whatever reason, you start to feel shame. So you might ask yourself, is this my shame, or is it actually their failed expectations? And why would their expectations bring up my shame? If you're feeling guilty, is this my guilt, or is it their judgment? And why might their judgment bring up my guilt? Maybe you're afraid. Is this fear their insecurity? And if so, why does their insecurity make me fearful? Is this my anxiety, or is it their helplessness? And why does their helplessness bring up my anxiety? Right? So we're starting to sift through the different degrees of influence that exist between us. And so as you start to ponder questions like this, answers will bubble up in your awareness, and you will experience an increased sense of self-definition and the ability to support varying degrees of emotional influence that we have in relationships with the establishment of healthy boundaries. And it's also going to help you avoid taking on too much, the baggage that, especially energetic baggage, emotional energetic baggage that isn't yours and really belongs to someone else. Okay. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and stay tuned for part 2.